to thank you all very much for joining us as usual, and a big thanks to the members of the Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar and the Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. This is a unique encounter, I should say, first time that these two teams are joining up. So we have with us on my immediate right Radhika Kumaraswamy, a member of the Fact-Finding Mission. In the center we have Marzuki Darusman, who's the chairperson of the Fact-Finding Mission. And then we have Yang Hee Lee, the Special Rapporteur in Myanmar, to Mr. Darusman's right. And then at the end of the table is Chris Sidoti, a member of the Fact-Finding Mission. We'll hear brief opening remarks from the chair and the rapporteur, and then over to you as usual for your questions. And if you could kindly identify yourself when posing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is such a great opportunity for all of us to be on this podium today. I think it is a very unique opportunity. For some time, I've been reporting that the situation of Myanmar, of human rights in Myanmar, is dire, and I am concerned that it is only worsening. And I'm sure this is what my colleagues here from the FFM have also been stressing all along since the start of their mandate. The list of political prisoners and those facing charges on politically motivated grounds is growing. In the past few weeks, Karen, Karenni, and Kachin activists have all been unjustly detained for their efforts to defend the rights of their communities. There's been a surge in the number of files cased against people accused of defaming the military, in particular in relation to reporting on the conflict against the Arakan Army and in Rakhine State. In the face of international condemnation, the suspension of mobile internet services remains fully in place for 4 townships in Rakhine State. However, I have been informed that even in those townships where the internet has been restored, it is very, very low, to the level of 2G, where people cannot really communicate through that internet system. In the context of the armed conflict between the Tatmadaw and the Arakan Army, the violence in Rakhine is escalating, and there are credible reports of Rakhine men being tortured and dying in custody, and Rakhine villages being burned. The Rohingya who are still in Rakhine remain confined to camps in central Rakhine, or within the few Rohingya villages are left in northern Rakhine, with their freedom of movement denied, while those that fled persecution for Bangladesh are themselves now being subjected to tighter restrictions, including to mobile internet. In just the last month, the protracted conflict in northern Shan erupted into serious fighting, and once again civilians were caught in the crossfire. Recently, there has been a little bit of a development where I know that today is the day when the Three Brotherly Alliance will be conducting some peace talk arrangements for peace with the government's National Reconciliation and Peace Commission. So I'm concerned what these talks will end up looking like. I wonder if there will be an enduring national ceasefire in the northern part of Myanmar. In this context, the situation is severe. The context of Myanmar is severe and warrants continued and sustained international action. Comprehensive monitoring and public reporting remains warranted, and accountability must be brought about by the international community to bring about justice for victims. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Orlando, and thank you, Yang Hee. You will know, of course, colleagues from the media, and thank you for coming this afternoon, that we are, in a real sense, a creature of the Special Rapporteur. And early on, we were accused of being somewhat precocious by exceeding our mandate. But what do you expect? We're just 2.5 years old. So you will hear a few things that came up in the latter part of our mandate that, in a way, adds on to the findings indicated by the Special Rapporteur in her numerous reports before. We were there just to amplify what really took place. And with the additional time allotted to us, the facts exceed so much the need for, on reasonable grounds, for an accountability to be, a process to be put in place. Now, we came up, as the fact-finding mission was tasked to look into eventually accountability processes. The high point in our previous report was, of course, the mentioning of the 6 generals, who are still around, some of them. Some of them have stepped down, perhaps, and moved on to other places. But the top dog is still there, the commander-in-chief, in spite of everything. But it takes a while to get to the bottom of things. Now, we've then expanded on that, and the list of alleged perpetrators have now gone up dramatically. We've then, of course, in a protocol, confidential protocol, have then submitted this separately to the High Commissioner. But more to the point, in terms of what's happening on the ground, we've also seen the evolution of the Tatmadaw strategy, and that is to add on the infamous 4 cuts of cutting funding, cutting food, cutting recruits and intelligence of insurgent groups, an additional 5th cut, and that is cutting of information. And therefore, it is crucial here that we bring out the fact that what works in Myanmar is pressure, international pressure, in the form of a continuous flow of public reporting. And we've come out, in a way, I wouldn't say advocating, but at least suggesting that this be considered by the Human Rights Council as an imperative, and that is that there will be a need for a, quote-unquote, a supplemental means of investigative, independent, robust public reporting to exert a continuous pressure on the government. And the 5th cut strategy, of course, cutting information, goes to the heart of the issue, and that is that moving forward, the key to any substantive action is to move the government of Myanmar to act in good faith and to heed the calls of the international community for internal reforms, but also to recognize that the atrocities will eventually lead to an accountability process that is now going to be undertaken by the IIFFM. We've transferred all the data that we've amassed during the past 2 years. It has been a clean transfer of all the materials, and it is now up to the IIFFM to proceed on that basis, of course, with adding on to their mandate, their investigative mandate of looking into the situation as we go along. But it is a time-sensitive material, and therefore speed is of the essence. And we expect that the IIFFM will then be able to proceed as fast as possible. That may be just a few points that I'd like to bring out just to open up the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. I should mention that copies of press release from the fact-finding mission and the opening statement delivered this morning, along with a document including recommendations, are in the back of the room, and I understand that there is a press release from the Rapporteur which will be sent out after this press conference. If you have a question specific to either the fact-finding mission or the Rapporteur, if you can indicate that. So, Antonio, please.
Thank you. I'm Antonio Broto from Spanish news agency IIFFM. My question goes to Ms. Yang Lee. Well, actually, it's two questions. First one is, you mentioned in the beginning that the number of detentions of activists is growing. Do you have numbers of that? And also, if among these detentions are journalists, because we follow a lot the story of the Reuters journalists. I don't know if this is happening again with some local journalists. And my second question, can you comment a little on the economic activities of the Tatmadaw in Myanmar and how this affects the Rakhine conflict and other conflicts? Are there many fights for resources in Myanmar? Thank you.
Thank you very much. These are very important questions. The political prisoners, the numbers are rising, but people who are incarcerated or charged or detained under politically motivated charges are increasing. There is quite a number who are in prison going through trial, and people who are outside of prison waiting trial. And the updated number is up in my report, in my GA report, and we are updating it as we speak. And in terms of the journalists, we have 41 journalists charged under this new government for writing up anything from the conflict in Rakhine, or about the military activities, or anything about Aung San Suu Kyi, and the famous case of Mintin Kokoji. He's still in prison, and the recent release or the amnesty of the two Reuters journalists who should have never been in prison in the first place, and their charges have not been dropped yet. Economic activities of the Tatmadaw, how does that affect in Rakhine, and how does it affect in other parts of Myanmar? Well, first of all, if they're involved in, and the fact-finding mission has gone into detail about the mining areas. I won't go into the mining areas, but if they're the activities in the hydropower, gas, and energy areas is where people have to be evicted from the lands to proceed with the projects of the military or military associate-owned companies, and that puts a lot of human rights violations and abuses on the civilians. Plus, we've seen the last report, my last oil report, the Tijit coal plant is emitting so much pollution in the air that children have been tested, and they go far beyond WHO standards. So it's not only creating physical human rights violations, but it's also impacting on the future generations and their health. And so, of course, much of the other, the Ministry of Energy and Electricity is a big area where is a lot of influence is in the economy of Myanmar. And I'm sure that the fact-finding mission has found some links with the activities of different ministries and the Tatmadaw. Thank you.
For the fact-finding mission, I should pick up that last question, since one of our three thematic reports now deal with economic interests. And we found, as we expected, that the economic links of the Tatmadaw are like an octopus with arms stretching in a wide range of areas. Economically, Myanmar is notoriously opaque, and so trying to actually get solid data was very difficult. But in our report, we were able to identify not only the two major holding companies, but in excess of 100 subsidiaries and another 30 companies that are basically controlled by the military directly or indirectly. Their links within the jade, ruby and gem industry are extensive, such that it would appear that they control perhaps 90% of that industry. But looking specifically at Rakhine State, the military is engaged with the support of businesses in some instances in the results of the clearance operations, the completion of the act of forcible deportation, and that is the razing of the villages, the construction of roads and of new military camps, and of housing for non-Rohingya population, part of the exercise of changing the demographic face of northern Rakhine State. And it's hard to get a grip on how much money we're talking about. We saw one internal document, which we are not able to verify, I hasten to add, but one internal document from around about 2012-2013, which indicated that in that 1 year, $250 million was distributed to military units in one command, the Western Command. If that document was accurate, it gives some indication of the scale. And where's the money going? It's certainly going into the pockets of the senior commanders. It's being used to pay supplements to very poorly paid foot soldiers, but it's also being used to fund the operations of the military because it's widely distributed. So that there is no doubt at all that the military's money is finding its way into corruption and corrupt activities, into supporting plain military operations, but also in enabling the military to shrug off any semblance of civilian control. We do know that they still take a large part of the state budget, around 13%. That goes through the Parliament. But all of this extra money coming from all of these business activities are extra budgetary and so totally beyond civilian control. Unless the military can be brought under control and unless civilians are prepared to exercise democratic oversight, there is no possibility of fundamental transformation within Myanmar. It's as simple as that at the end.
Thank you both. Next question. Do you have a follow-up, Antonio?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Back to the journalists, as you mentioned, the number. Can this be compared with figures of the past when Myanmar was ruled by military regime? Or in other words, is being a journalist now in Myanmar as dangerous as back then?
Fortunately, the comparison is not available because currently the civil society who's been tracking these numbers, they were not able to track these numbers when it was on the previous government.
Yes, hello. Agnès Pedrero, Agence France Presse. The questions are for the fact-finding mission. The first question, last year you gave the name of some generals that you think that they should be prosecuted for their role in the Rakhine states. So I would like to know now if you think that Aung San Suu Kyi should be also prosecuted. What are your views about her role in this? And another question would be on the investigative calls that you are doing. What is your call for the Human Rights Council? Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, we did list 6 generals we thought were primarily responsible in terms of command responsibility for the atrocities that took place in August 2017 and beyond that. That was enabled by the fact that we assembled, and we thought that we should bring this out. Now, as we wind down, there may be some thoughts as to what we could have done more if we had time, if we had resources. But in the past 9 to 10 months, we've extended the list to quite a significant figure, and so further investigations will, we believe, disclose further involvement of those responsible for these atrocities. So it's not a final list. It's not a ultimate list. The IIM may come up with its own listing of people. But to your question regarding Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi, we formulated our conclusions and recommendations on the basis of goodwill that Myanmar is going through a transition, and it's a democratic transition. And therefore, in our first report, we absolved Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi from any direct responsibility. But then, subsequently, there was this ongoing process that needed to be addressed by the government, and the State Council was not as clear as we would wanted it to be, and therefore questions came up whether or not she might also be in a way implicated. But that is for the judicial process to address. For the moment, I think we will leave it at that and entrust the further process to the IIMM as to how this is going to be addressed in the future. Thank you. Oh, what was that? Sorry.
Yes, my second question was about what are you asking to the Human Rights Council in terms of investigations? You say more investigations are needed. So what are you asking to the Human Rights Council? Are you asking for more missions, for more what?
Well, yes and no. This comes to the earlier question on the journalists, you know, and the issue of international pressure being effective in an early release of the two Reuters journalists is a manifestation of a direct linkage between pressure and behavior. Now, the IIM is tasked to look into this matter with a specific mandate to investigate, but also to prepare files for prosecution. But in the meantime, we all know that there is a continuing need for spotlighting, for continuing focusing on Myanmar, and that requires what we have termed in our Human Rights Council presentation as a need for a supplemental process of investigation, independent investigative public reporting that would escort, in a way, quote unquote, the IIMM moving forward. In an analogy of the Syrian IIIM and the Commission of Inquiry. Now, that would be ideally addressed by the Special Rapporteur, but that will require additional resources. And this is the dilemma now that is being faced. and that is that there is a need for that, and the Human Rights Council is authorized and mandated to address this issue. And so we were just laying it out to the Council that that is the key in moving forward. If there's going to be any changes, that is substantive compared to what has indeed not happened in the past 2 years.
Thank you. I have Laurent, and then Nina, Nick, and then Gabby.
Laurent Siro from the Swiss news agency over here. By the way, it's a little bit a kind of follow-up on the previous question. So it's planned that the mandate of your mission will end once the IIFFM will be fully operational, which seems not to be the case yet. They just started to be operational. So some countries tend to think that you should be extended for a while. That means either a few months or a full year. So do you expect anything in that regard from the Council, or do you consider that your mandate will end with that session?
Yes, yes, yes.
Let me just say that the setting up of the fact-finding mission is an extraordinary measure, and the normal way of doing things is to entrust the issue to the standing institutions within the UN, the OHCHR, the Special Rapporteur, and the Special Envoys and all that. But then there is a clear sense that this government is acting in bad faith. This is going further than what we said in the Council, and therefore there needs to be a way of pointing it out. Now, if the Council is seized on this issue, then we'll have to decide on what would be the best way forward. We're not advocating any particular mechanism, but we're just flagging the fundamental need to address this dimension of the process that requires agility of the UN to address these kinds of current issues, ongoing issues that the IIIM may not be entirely equipped to do. And therefore, discussing this in a very frank manner with Nick Kumjian, he in fact came out saying that he wouldn't have any objections to that. So we'll leave it up to you and see how it unfolds.
Go ahead.
So you're ready to go on if the Council decides so, right?
I'm not saying that.
That was the question.
No, let me just say that the three of us, we've been preoccupied with this. It's not that easy to walk away from this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Nina, go ahead.
Hi, Nina Larson, AFP. So I have a question for Ms. Yanghee Lee. Yesterday, before the Council, you mentioned the issue of, I think, 34 camps that you saw from satellite imagery being constructed. What indications do you have of how these will be used? I mean, you indicated that they might be used for Rohingya returning. And what does that say about the safety of Rohingya to return from Bangladesh? And also on the cutting of the communications technology, if you could say a little bit more about how that's being used. I mean, we've seen it being used also in the camps in Bangladesh. Is there some sort of coordination with the Myanmar government to try to cut communications for the Rohingya? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The 34 camps that the satellite images shows are built, I think, for the purpose of the returnees. But, you know, having said that, maybe the Myanmar government will now come around and say, no, that's not what we intended them to be. This really begs the question of, are you going to segregate them forever? And they will be away from their place of origin. Will they be returned with their livelihood, their land that was raised and other constructions have been built on it? Will they be given back their cattle? Some had shrimp farms, and will they be given those back? And will they have freedom of movement, et cetera, and et cetera? It's just a cosmetic thing that I think that, okay, we've got these villages all ready for you to come back to, but are they all ready for the Rohingyas to go back to? About the internet mobile shutdown, I don't want to make any connections with Myanmar and the Bangladesh situation. And I think it would be very dangerous for any of you to make that connection if it was coordinated by Myanmar. During the monsoon season, it was very, the international community, myself and others, were relying on the messages and the video and the images that were coming out from the people in the townships. But when they cut that down, you know, satellite images, with it being monsoon season, it's not easy to really see what goes on from satellite when it's monsoon season. And they've returned, as I said, they've reconnected service for 5 townships, but still 4 is completely shut down. And these 4 townships are the 4 townships where there is heavy fighting now, increased fighting, and increased deployment of the Tamadal. Thank you.
Nick.
Yeah, Nick Cumming-Bruce, New York Times. Just in respect of your comments about possible responsibilities of Aung San Suu Kyi, given that she has, as we are led to understand, she has no real control over the military, in what areas do you think she may be complicit in some of the violations that you're talking about? And secondly, in your statement to the Council this morning, you talked about your satisfaction with the evidence of some business disengagement with Myanmar as a result of your earlier reporting. Could you give some idea about the scale of that? There's been some limited sanctioning by the United States, but very little evidence of significant follow-up activity. So could you just speak to that issue a little bit more?
On the economic, I'll refer to Chris. Just quickly on Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi. You will know that we had this back and forth with the Myanmar representative this morning on the term clearance operations. It was clear that he was not even aware that this is an official term used by the President's office and the State Councillor. And so it gives you a sense that the whole government is simply untogether. And it's probably the case that Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi may not be knowledgeable of what took place in August. But the issue now is that subsequently there was no further addressing of this issue on her part, and so it will become a legal issue whether or not there's an element of culpability here, and so we're not equipped to make any determination on that, because we are not a judicial mission. We are a fact-finding mission that was tasked to look into the circumstances of what took place there. So it's still an open-ended question. To what extent she might be implicated, but then again, that is for all of us to make our determination as to how we see the country moving on further into a more democratic setting. So, Chris, over to you.
Can I first just add to Marzuki's comments on your first question? It's clear that the civilian side of the government does not control the military side of the government, but the civilian side of the government has very substantial constitutional responsibilities. We reported now, this year, that there is no significant change in the human rights situation in Myanmar for the positive in the last 12 months. And there are a number of changes for the negative. The longer this goes on, the more the civilian side of the government is responsible. The civilian side controls education, and Rohingya children do not have access to schooling. They're responsible for healthcare, and people in IDP camps in Kachin and Shan and Rakhine State do not have access to healthcare. The National League for Democracy controls the parliament, even allowing for the 25% of seats that are military seats. Of the total number of seats in parliament, 60% are NLD seats. They control every law in Myanmar except the constitution. They can change the Citizenship Act and haven't. They can repeal the 4 laws for the protection of race and religion from 2015 and haven't. They can change the laws dealing with freedom of media and haven't. They can change the laws dealing with freedom of association and assembly and haven't. They run the courts. They run the prosecution service. The longer this goes on, the more impossible it is for the civilian side of the government to escape international criminal responsibility for the human rights situation in Myanmar. So let's just not focus on who runs the military. Let's look at the totality. Your second question is perhaps more straightforward. We've published on our website, and you have access to it therefore, any correspondence we have received from corporations in response to our economic interest report. So you can see a number there. We've had one major internal conglomerate in Myanmar that has indicated that already they have started disengagement some years ago from military-operated companies, and that is now company policy. We have had a number of international companies that have indicated that they are disengaging from the military. Others have said that they will withdraw from economic zones that are run by the military. Now, there are not the entire international business community by any stretch of the imagination, but as the chairman said in his comments to the council, we are seeing the start of some very positive signs. And that includes at the national level. You heard the statement from the Austrian representative today of referring our report to Austrian companies that are operating in Myanmar. We know there has been discussion in the Netherlands Parliament. Things are happening. Japanese corporations even, which tend to be more directed towards business without corporate responsibility in many respects, are saying that they're taking this seriously. Our report addresses the responsibilities of consumers as well, and this is relevant so far as the garment industry is concerned. So I think we are seeing the first stirrings of change, not yet anything like an avalanche, but it's building up as a snowball does.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, though. I mean, the longer this goes on, the harder it will be for the civilian government to escape responsibility for the human rights situation in the country. The worst offences are being committed by the Tatmadaw, not by the civilian government. Yes, they may be responsible for what the Special Rapporteur has alluded to in terms of increased detentions, political detentions, but these are not, I think, crimes that can be prosecuted by an ad hoc tribunal. So perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit more on where this is going for the civilian government, where their responsibilities are exposing them to some form of criminal prosecution.
Sure.
Just one sentence only before Yang He moves. The things that you describe are precisely elements of the crime against humanity of persecution that we have found in relation to the Rohingya in Rakhine State. And they are civilian governmental responsibilities. So we are talking about crimes under international law, even if you want to disaggregate them and say, well, schooling's not a crime under international law, but it is one element of the crime against humanity of persecution that we are seeing in Rakhine State against the Rohingya. 2 sentences.
Okay,
Sorry.
thank you very much. For instance, the increased charges against the journalists who are reporting about the conflict areas. What's that doing? They're shutting the people's ears and eyes, and the government is letting them do this so that people will not be hearing about what's happening in these conflict areas. And the new government has enacted new laws, which is very repressive and continues to do that. I had given the new government a list of 200-plus laws to the Sherman Committee on Legal Affairs, the laws that need to be amended, abolished, or rescinded. None of them have been taken any actions on. And so I think what we're seeing is, and the Internet shutdown was ordered by the authorities, the government authorities, for the Internet shutdown. And without Internet and during conflict, during natural disasters, we have seen reports of many people suffering because they were not, the disaster preparedness was not there because they couldn't inform others. And the food assistance, they didn't have enough food supply because they weren't ready for all this. And so this is, I think, it's really supporting what Chris is saying about crimes against humanity and actually emboldening the Tatmadaw to carry on their business as usual. Thank you.
Just say something. Whatever one may think about whether crimes, they're implicated in crimes or not, there is the doctrine of state responsibility. So therefore, they are implicated before the ICJ. And under, maybe the Genocide Convention or other things. So that may be the route that might finally happen. It may not be before a criminal court. But still, there is state responsibility for these issues. And that doctrine of state responsibility is specifically attached to the civilian government.
Gabby.
Yes, thank you very much. Gabriela Sotomayor, Mexican journalist, Proceso. On accountability, it's a kind of follow-up of my colleague's question. In the statement says that the finding of state responsibility means that Myanmar should be brought before the ICC court for failing to honor its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention. And you say that as well that Myanmar requires many avenues of justice. It called that the UN Security Council to refer Myanmar to the ICC court. My question is, do you think this could happen one day? Member states are failing to the Rohingyas. UN is failing to them. So what is your expectations? I mean, your concrete expectations or your goal? I don't know. This is the gravity of the situation is no, like that. So.
Of course it will happen. We're sure it will happen. It's a question of when. Cambodia, it took 40 years, and that may not be good enough. But we feel that there's enough evidence now, and there's now a prosecutorial authority. At least they might be prosecuted in various national courts. There may be evidence gathered and kept. It'll be kept for a long time because of this prosecutorial authority. You're going to have all that evidence ready and waiting for a tribunal for a national tribunal, international tribunals, etc. We're on the road, and it just depends where and when. I think we must not give up hope on that.
Just a follow-up, but if you said to the victims that maybe this could take 40 years.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Some is happening already. The International Criminal Court's underway. The wheels of international justice turn agonisingly slowly, but the International Criminal Court started a preliminary examination in September last year. The prosecutor has applied to the court now for approval to commence a formal investigation, and that decision is expected at any time. The jurisdiction is limited to the forcible deportation from Rakhine State and the circumstances that began it. But also, it's not under the Genocide Convention, it's ICJ rather than ICC, International Court of Justice. Gambia, on behalf of the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, has been leading that, and we have a side event, I'm happy to tell you all, at 2 o'clock, at which the Gambian Minister for Justice will be the moderator. But I don't know, but we'll ask him how quickly we expect to see that application. So it's not as though we're waiting 40 years while we recognise that, that, as I say, this is agonisingly slow. But it has begun, and the authorities in Myanmar need to know it has started. This is not something we're waiting for, it has started.
If I may, yes, 40 years sounds very long time, but we have to remember that it's not just in the Rakhine State for the Rohingyas, the other ethnic minorities have suffered very similar persecutions under the Tatmadaw, under the military rule. But we have to also remember that it may not provide immediate remedy or justice to the actual people that were subjected to these crimes, but at least things of this nature will not happen again in Myanmar. We've seen in the 70s when the Rohingyas were driven out to Bangladesh. We've seen 90s, 92, we've seen in the 2000, we've seen in 2016, 2017. There was massive deportations. We should not be able to see that again. We should, and because of these different initiatives, and as Chris has rightly said, the ball is starting to roll, although it's maybe in a very snail speed, but we are confident that as long as we and you put a spotlight, as my colleagues here have said, then we will prevent similar things happening in the future too.
Thank you. Well, Julia, please. And then I think maybe after that, the last question may have to be Jamie in the back.
It's a similar question, but you mentioned that you've transferred all the materials to the mechanism for Myanmar. And what is next? Where does the Security Council come into this before the case ends up at the ICJ? And what obstacles do you foresee at the Security Council when it comes to this issue? And ultimately, who do you want to see face the ICJ? Thank you.
Well, I think basically we have approached the Security Council. We have last year, Mr. Darusman went and briefed them. I had an ARIA formula with them in August, and we are pushing them, to try and refer the matter full to the ICC, because at the moment only the forced deportation cases are being heard, because it's only what matters in Bangladesh that is covered. But I sense the political will for that is not there. A major superpower is totally against the ICC. The second is to push towards some kind of ad hoc tribunal. And even then, I would say the political will is not completely there, though it didn't seem completely closed, but it's not completely there. And I think one just has to keep putting pressure on that. With regard to the ICJ, I think it was Gambia that was taking the lead in taking that case. He will be there chairing our side event today. I think he's the person who's taking the lead, the Minister of what is it? What is it? Justice? Yeah, and hopefully, see, the ICJ would result in reparations. Hopefully, it doesn't necessarily have to, because the Genocide Convention does not necessarily, unlike say the ICC, have a trust fund for victims or anything like that. But you can structure the court case so much so that at least you can go towards some kind of form of reparations or compensation for the victims. So that would be the kind of mechanism the ICJ would provide, rather than punishment in jail, which is what the ICC or ad hoc tribunal would provide.
Just 30 seconds on that. It would be ideal for an ASEAN country to also refer Myanmar to ICJ, because it's no longer a Myanmar issue now. It's a regional issue. There's so many Rohingyas living in several ASEAN countries, and so I think it would be ideal for an ASEAN country to also join in this pursuit for accountability.
You don't seem happy.
Speaking as someone who's often not happy with answers, I'll take the microphone. My question is you've talked about a lot of things here, obviously, and issues about accountability, reparations, and I want to really just focus on the very most basic questions, such as when will these abuses stop by your view? Whether or not you talked about Aung San Suu Kyi, but you were also about fact finding, right? So what facts did you come up with about her communications with anyone within her government or with the military that could somehow point to any type of implication for her in what happened to the Rohingya during the Exodus? Because that, I think, seems to be told. And then the last question, of course, is when can these people return home? I mean, when by your judgment, with all of your expertise, what conditions need to occur? I mean, is it, in your view, your expert view, when can these people return home in the proper conditions? So,
just maybe start with the last part of the question. You'll be aware that, of course, the issue of repatriation is being addressed. But it's the view of the fact-finding mission, as I recall, that there has to be a sign of a gesture on the part of the Myanmar government, and this is easily undertaken by just addressing the situation of the remaining 600,000 Rohingyas in Myanmar. It's come down as to that. It's as simple as that. Now, nothing, and I repeat, nothing, has been done to moderate the initial conditions that eventually led to the August 2017 atrocities. So what is there to ask again? If that is addressed, then the refugees in Cox's Bazar will just move in droves to Myanmar. They continue to have communications, contacts with their brethren in Myanmar, and so it's not something that you could calculate on a down to individual cases of being moved from Cox's Bazar to back to Myanmar. This is a communal community. They move in families. They move in village groups in one go. They don't move one by one. And so the whole conceptual aspect of return to Myanmar is defective. And so if there's any hope of returning, then the situation on the ground will have to be fundamentally altered. And as my colleagues have said, it's not the case. So on the issue of Mrs. Aung San Suu Kyi's communications, we of course have had to rely on facts available that eventually led us to enable us to make these conclusive findings that these atrocities took place. And but to establish a direct link on the basis of facts, that can only be done on an inference basis. Yeah, and there's been indicative statements from the Commander-in-Chief that anything that we do, we consult with the State Councillor. What does that mean? And so again, this is a conditional and an open-ended question, but then again, it's something that will have to be clarified at some point.
Allow me to pick up on your second question, and there's been a big population of the Kaman Muslims who are recognized as ethnic, 100 of the 135 ethnic minorities. Some of them are still living in IDP camps. The free quarter called Ang Menglar is not a free quarter. It's a worst ghetto and an internment camp. There's no freedom of movement, there's no education, nothing there. One last thing is, let's not forget what happened in 2014 when there was a pilot study for citizenship verification. And the people in Myeobun IDP camp, they all went through that. Where are they now? Some have moved to some places next to the Myeobun original IDP camps. They still don't have freedom of movement. So this is a clear indication. And the people in Myeobun camp, some already had citizenship cards, some were Buddhists, some were from other parts of Myanmar, and there were some who were Kaman Muslims too. Okay. And in Chokpyu, there's also Kaman IDP camps in Chokpyu, and they're still there. Thank you.
Just add a quick comment on this one. We said in our report to the Council today, in one simple sentence, return at this stage is impossible. We had 42 states participate in responding to our report, and not one of them referred to that sentence. The conditions of return are all nicely stated. You know, the voluntary, safe, dignified, sustainable. But almost all of the attention is placed on voluntary. But those four conditions have subjective and objective elements. Voluntary is subjective. They subjectively decide that they will go. But the international community has an obligation in relation to the objective elements. And objectively, it is not safe. And yet, we go through all this business, are they willing to go? The issue is not just subjectively willing, but objectively safe. and it's not. And it's not for the reasons that Yang He has indicated. And if you want a single indicator, the single best indicator of when return can take place is when the 600,000 who remain are living in a situation where they have full human rights, the lot. Then we know that return can take place. But it's about time, it's long overdue, but the time has come for the international community, whatever that is, to appreciate the fact that return is impossible now, and are we going to expect that 1.2 million people to continue to be hostages to the negotiations and the pretense that it's going to happen any day?
Thank you all very much for this press conference. I just should mention that the side event that was referred to is in room 8 from 2:30 to 4, should you want to continue this conversation. I also wanted to mention to you, should you have any difficulty finding some of the documentation, including on economic interests on the website, which has detailed communications, please approach us and we'll be happy to point you to that. So again, thank you to the fact-finding mission, to Yang He Lee, the rapporteur, and to you for joining us here. Thanks.